Hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 3, Episode 5, Silent Witness, starring Don Taylor as Professor Mason, Dolores Hart as Claudia, and Patricia Hitchcock as Nancy. And this is an interesting episode in some ways. It's also pretty uneven in my opinion. I often think that on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, you kind of got to suspend your disbelief a little bit and just go with the episodes. But in the case of Silent Witness, you really have to suspend your disbelief at some of the character motivations and just the overall plot in general, which is actually pretty well done in places. Unfortunately, like I said, some of it you really have to suspend your disbelief to get into. So we start with a professor, and he's teaching some Shakespeare, Richard III, I believe, which is always interesting. And he's the main character, and his class ends, and one of his students comes up to him. Her name is Claudia. Seems innocent enough, but soon we see that something's definitely going on between them, or at least it's implied, and she wants to meet up that night, although the professor doesn't really seem too excited about the idea. So then we go to another scene with the professor and his wife Nancy. And he decides he wants to go out, but she says she has some kind of class that night. She's in some kind of gym club or something. I don't know. I thought it was kind of strange, but you got to just kind of go with it. Why he really wants to get out is getting out of seeing Claudia. But he gets a call from her, and she says she's babysitting. And it seems like the house she's at is right nearby, and you can actually see through the window, which is somewhat important to the plot. And, the fact that she's babysitting is also important to the plot. So the professor, probably feeling he has no choice, goes to see Claudia. And they kiss, and it's also important that there's a baby in the room at this point. They chat, and the professor's concerned about getting caught. He's saying it'll ruin his reputation, and he wants to end things. But Claudia wants to get married. She definitely has some other ideas than him at this point. The professor says no way, but Claudia basically threatens him and says she'll basically tell about them anyway. So at this point, the professor snaps, rather abruptly, I have to say, but he really snaps, and he does in Claudia. He kills her, and at this point, the baby starts crying pretty conveniently right after this murder takes place. And this is where the plot starts to get a little bit crazy, in my opinion. So at this point, the professor is visited by the police, a sergeant, and they talk. The sergeant says it's routine. He's talking to everyone about, the girl Claudia's death. And he says one of the students is suspected at this point, even though we know differently. He asks about the house. He says, did you realize you could see through the window from where you live? And of course, the professor plays it off like he never really thought about it. And the sergeant jokingly brings up the baby as a witness at this point, which was kind of humorous. So at this point, we have another chat between the professor and his wife Nancy, and the significance of this is basically that she talks about how babies can see things, and after they learn to talk, they might talk about them and say what they saw. So like I said, you have to just kind of go with it. So at this point, the professor's kind of concerned because he knows the baby was a witness. And after he talks to the baby's mother and sees the baby again, the baby starts crying again when she sees him. So he's really nervous. And I have to admit, at this point of the episode, there is a lot of tension and suspense. It's very well done. The professor actually goes to see the baby again. I'm not sure what his intent is at this point, if he's planning something sinister or if he's just testing out a theory, that the baby knows about what he did. But this is a pretty creepy and disturbing scene. He's standing like right over the baby. Of course, the baby cries again. So the baby's mother freaks out and calls the police, even though he hightails it out of there pretty quickly. So the professor gets another visit from the sergeant, who says, the baby's mother called, the baby saw someone. So the professor plays it off again. He says he was sleeping. So at this point, basically, the professor, after a few more scenes, is in class again, and another young girl comes up to him asking questions, and he's seeing Claudia, a vision of her, even though this is definitely a different girl. So he's basically losing it at this point. And this is the thing. I'm not sure if he just feels guilt or if he thinks he's going to be caught, because of something that the baby's going to do in the future. It's not really clear, but he abruptly just goes and confesses to this crime. I thought this kind of came out of nowhere and wasn't really convincing. I'm not sure why he decided now was the time to confess. But like I said, there's a lot of things in this episode you just have to go with. But his character motivation didn't satisfy me here. Others may find it to their satisfaction. So at this point, after he confesses, obviously the professor's in trouble, and we get one last scene where the baby's father comes home. He's been away, and the baby cries again, and it turns out the baby always cries when she's around someone she's not familiar with, especially men, I guess. So I guess the baby wasn't really crying because of the murder after all, which kind of makes sense and is kind of predictable, but this ending was just strange and a little silly, kind of like the whole episode. So this is one of those episodes you gotta kind of just go with. The premise behind it doesn't totally work for me, or the character motivations, but there are parts of the episode that are very well done in spite of all this. The episode is genuinely suspenseful and creepy and fast moving, and I was somewhat invested in it. So definitely a mixed bag for me, and I'm going to give Silent Witness a 2.5 out of 5. But I would say maybe to watch this episode because it is very different from everything else, and I feel like opinions will vary. So 2.5 out of 5 for Silent Witness. And as always, thank you very much for watching.